Welcome to the Office of Children's Mental Health Trauma-Informed Care Training. The topic for this session is growing into authentic allyship and racial justice. This is the second part of our segment on exploring race and culture from a trauma-informed lens. I'm Linda Hall, Director of the Office of Children's Mental Health, and I'll be moderating our panel discussion. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Armando Hernandez, Chief Diversity Officer at Journey Mental Health, Pat Parker, Curriculum and Instruction Manager at the Helen Bader School of Social Welfare at UW-Milwaukee, and William Park Sutherland, Health Policy Analyst at Kids Forward. Welcome to each of you, and thank you for being here to share your expertise on this much talked about issue. Recent dialogue on the topic of allyship indicates the term can be problematic. We all know that words matter. So we want to begin with each of our panelists sharing their thoughts on allyship. Let's start with Armando.
Thank you so much, Linda. I really appreciate being here and dialogue and conversation. So when I think about this broad and really engaging topic of allyship and solidarity, I think two initial considerations for me that are important is that beginning with a sense of inner work or personal work is really an important place to start. We really have to be committed to learning our own history and also the history of historically oppressed and marginalized groups. That process of learning and educating oneself is really critical. We also really need to do that foundational work that so many of us are familiar with around implicit, unconscious, and subtle bias, because those really show up all the time. And if we haven't done that work, it's really going to affect how we see this work and how we relate to others. And also to courageously acknowledge our own participation in oppressive systems in an ongoing manner. And that work also leads to the second consideration, which is the idea that this really has to be everyday ongoing work. Allyship isn't just a single event, it's just something that we do, but it's something that we are committed. We're committed to deep and ongoing listening, to using whatever privilege and opportunities and resources we have to amplify the voices of those that are at the margins that are oppressed, and to really accept criticism and feedback with grace, even if it is uncomfortable. Now, broadly, when I think when we think about this work, we really think in these three particular forms that allyship can work. The first one is really not really allyship. We could call it performative charity. And really what is the focus of performative charity is the idea that we are helping those others, intentional, that are disadvantaged. The focus here is on personal intent. That is, I as a person, I am helping other people. Now, again, that may be something beneficial, right? To be charitable, to offer a donation, to do something good, can be something very positive. But it's important to understand that that performative charity is very different than authentic charity, which is really focused on the interpersonal impact. The driver here is to really act with compassion. There's the sense that we can grow as a community, that we can improve our relationship, that we need to really be focused on the strength of others, including those that might be experiencing discrimination or bias. And yet authentic allyship is different from yet a third form, which is embodied solidarity. And here the focus is on cultural and political transformation. There's a sense of sharing power and really, again, enhancing and supporting the voices of those individuals and communities that are at the margins and that are historically oppressed. When we embody something, it means that it's just integrated into who I am. Even acting with compassion, as great as that is, it suggests the idea that I'm suddenly acting and then I'm not acting. But when I embody something, it means that it's just part of who I am. I am not suddenly becoming somebody who is an advocate for belonging or equity or social justice. I do that work day in and day out. For myself, that's certainly something that takes humility because it's an ongoing process for me to really be engaged in that work on an everyday fashion.
Thank you, Armando, for highlighting those important points, those different aspects on authentic allyship. So now let's turn to William. William, what will you add to this conversation?
Thanks, Linda. And thank you, Armando and Pat. It's great to be in space with you again. This is such a joy to share space with you and talk about these ideas and the work. When I think about allyship and sort of the challenges to the concept of allyship, I'm reminded of this idea that I think white people often get caught up in, which is, having some trouble with these ideas sort of being reinvented and repackaged, and now I'm not using the right words anymore. And so I want to, go back to or remind you something that Armando just said, which is to focus on intent, and recognize that if you're having trouble with a new concept or challenges to an old concept, really challenge yourself to understand why you're having trouble, and then ask yourself if it's really appropriate for you to decide what feels right, and for you to decide what words make sense for the struggle for racial justice. Recognize it's not primarily about you. It's not primarily about white people. It's important to follow the kind of ever-evolving work and thought of BIPOC organizations and leaders. Armando also said that this work is ongoing, and this is something that you embody. And so to do that, speaking as a white person, you really need to understand why you're doing it, why you're called to this work. If you're doing it for a badge, you're not going to get a badge probably. And when you don't get that, you probably stop. And it's going to be hard, and there's going to be conflict, and you're going to make mistakes, and hopefully you're going to be confronted about those mistakes. And I'll talk a little bit more in the next segment about what you might do when you get confronted. But recognizing that you have to really understand why you're here, because you won't show up on a day-to-day basis if you don't have a sense of your position within this movement without centering yourself in it. And then recognizing and being honest about how these systems of oppression have impacted you and your communities and your people and the people and places that you care about. The last thing I would say is, there really isn't anywhere to arrive at. This is going to be a constant journey. This is going to be learning and growing and unlearning. And this isn't a certificate. This is a call to think and act and embody differently and center justice in your life, not just in your work.
Thanks, William. Thanks for those thoughts on what we should avoid, how we should prepare ourselves, and the importance of really sticking with it. Now, Pat, what do you have to add to this conversation about the allyship?
My brothers did such an excellent job of covering this topic. I'll try to be brief, but kind of to the point. I'm also uncomfortable, like they are, with the word allyship, especially when the ally, kind of like Armando said, is focused on someone else's oppression. If their allyship is based on what they perceive as someone being mistreated, and they feel compelled to rescue this mistreated person, see, then their allyship is no longer necessary if they resolve the issue positively. Problem fixed. However, if that incident escalates from the negative tension, then the reason for them getting involved sometimes is outweighed by the negative tension and they want out. That leaves the people, the person of color, feeling abandoned by who they thought was an ally. Here's another example. If someone becomes an ally because they feel guilty, let's say they went to a workshop and they realized that in some way they profited from persons of color oppression or discrimination. Now, when they see other people in the movement suggesting some type of recompense should be given and is owed to people of color, they may feel, wait a minute, I don't want to do that. So the cost of being ally outweighs their motivation. It's kind of like Armando said, got to look at the intent, that motivation. However, what I've experienced in my life is some real authentic allies. I'd like to share a story with you. I call this one the moral dilemma, taking a stand. My daughter and I, when she was about 5 years old, I took her to one of those fast food places that has the play castle there. And I'm going to talk about mother number one and mother number two. Well, when we arrived, mother number one and her daughter were already there, and the daughter was playing in the castle. My daughter chomps down her meal, gets in that castle. About 15 minutes, these girls are playing, having a great time. Well, then mother number two and her daughter comes in. Shortly after her daughter joins the other two in the play castle, daughter number one comes out. That little girl's face is, you could tell she's upset. She goes right to her mother. Then my daughter comes out, and being a child of a social worker, she turns to little girl number two and says, "You're not a nice friend." Remember, she's about 5 years old. And then she looks at me and she said, "I want to go home now." I said, "Well, what happened, honey?" And she said, little girl number two, told girl number one, "Don't play with her because she does not look like us." Well, I looked at mother number two and she looked away. And she tells her daughter to sit down and finish her lunch. Well, okay, I'm packing up things to leave because I'm trying to keep myself in composure in front of my daughter. And then mother number one and her daughter comes over to us. And the mother looks at me and she says, "Please don't leave yet. Allow our two girls to play again, if only for a couple of minutes." Before I can even answer, those two little girls grab each other's hand, off to the play castle they go, having fun. Well, with that being done, mother number two packs up her daughter, leaves, walk right by us, not saying a word. Mother number one looks at me, I look at her, we just smile. See, now that's being an authentic ally. It's lived. What did he say? You hold that in your body. It's lived. She wanted to teach her daughter a moral lesson about true friendship and also how to handle homegrown bias.
That's a great story. Thanks for sharing that with us and adding it to your comments, Pat. Well, now with your insights on the words allyship, now we'd like to dig into the difference between allyship and really being committed, what we're going to call authentic allyship. Now we'd like to move on to the second part of our discussion and push ourselves to be concrete in what authentic allyship and action look like. So I'd like to start with you, William. Please share with us your thoughts on authentic allyship.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that story, Pat. It is a really powerful example of that much of this work is in the little things and in the standing up and speaking out and not kind of going with the flow and not wanting to rock the boat. So one of the things that I wanted to say about this is, I mean, I think one of the roles that white people can take is to challenge other white people when they see racism and to act in solidarity. And Pat's example is perfect. I will also say, particularly when there are only white people in the room, it's really important to challenge racism. I was once talking with a bunch of white people who said, "Oh, it's okay. We don't have to talk about racism. There's no racism here. We're all white people," which we know is, not the case. One of my colleagues once said to me, one of my colleagues at Kids Forward, "It's not if whiteness is operating in the room, but how whiteness and racism is operating in the room." And that's especially true in white-only spaces. And I can tell you that, being in many of them over my life. Silence from white people is not okay. Silence reinforces racism and reinforces those subtle messages. So I think about how different that little girl's message would have been if that mother hadn't allowed for and wanted those two kids to play together again, right? What lesson she would have learned by having that be okay, even if after the fact she said, "Oh, it was really bad that other kid did that and that mom did that." It was a much more powerful lesson for her to intervene right away. And so the sort of next thing I want to say is that even if you don't know what to say, saying something and doing something in the moment is really, really important, and pushing yourself to do that thing. You might not know the right thing to say. You might say the wrong thing even. Like going back to intent, I think that if you are coming from a place of wanting to act in solidarity and wanting to act with justice in your gut, lots of people will notice that. And saying the wrong thing in the moment, trying to do the right thing, is probably better, almost certainly better, than saying nothing and then trying to do something after the fact. And one trick, if you're like, "Oh my God, I don't know how to do that. How do I confront people? What do I do?" Practice. It sounds a little silly, but practicing, thinking about what you're gonna say, maybe even role playing it with a colleague of yours so that you can know what to say, is a really good idea. So that's one thing that I think is a concrete step that white people can take to be more of an ally more often. The two last things I'm going to say in a minute, apparently, are that if you are doing that and you get called out or you get criticized by people who are pointing out, how maybe your actions have hurt them unintentionally, recognize that really is a gift. Robin DiAngelo talks about how when people are giving you feedback about your racism, they're really putting a lot of trust in you to recognize that, to change, to be open to change. And so focus on that impact, really think about what you've done and thank them for the feedback that they've given you, because they've helped you to be a better ally. They've helped you to act more often in solidarity. And if that's your goal, then that's gold, what they've given you. All right, my time's up.
Thanks, William. Thanks for the reminder that white people need in white spaces. and we need to be gracious when people offer us criticism. So with that, we'd like to turn to Armando and ask you to highlight something here.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, William, and thank you, Pat, for the story. You know, when we tap into the wisdom of our young people, right? I start making connections too. So I remember, I don't know the details, but the details aren't important. I remember talking with my two daughters who are, you know, now teenagers and way wiser than me. And I remember getting into them. We were talking about a situation of something was said and what should we do? And my oldest daughter just turns to me and says, there's nothing controversial here. There's nothing controversial about speaking truth to power. There's nothing controversial about being an ally, about highlighting it. We often, right, as adults and in our minds, we get caught up in the details, right? And we analyze and we overanalyze. And I'm sure that your daughter wasn't thinking it, right? Wasn't overanalyzing. Ooh, so what would be the impact of me saying you're not a good friend? No, right? As you said, she was embodying that in the moment and just sort of came out. So I really appreciate that. So for me, when I think about what we do in this space, I think that, yeah, we listen deeply to the experience. We really are paying attention. But then we just have a deep conviction, right? We have a deep commitment. Friendship, right? And that story is a deep commitment. And, you know, often, particularly in our world of human services and mental health, we have a deep commitment to productivity. And we have an equally deep commitment, right, to equity and to deliver services in a way that are going to be responsive to the needs that, that everyone presents to us. So now, when I think about all of this, one of the ideas that I find very organizing, and it's a little bit theoretical, but I just really draw a lot of inspiration from, is the idea of decentered practice, right? And the notion here is that when we act, when we do things, there are some questions that we can ask. Is whose voice is at the center? Whose voice are we really prioritizing in the moment? Whose values do we feel are most important? And another way of looking at it is whose stories is preferred in this moment. And when you act in a decentered way, it means that my story, my values, my preferences are not at the center. And again, I know many of us in the space, again, are in the mental health and human services field. And sometimes when we are providing a service, we're delivering, right, psychotherapy or care management or coordination, we often do it in a way where we as professionals are placed at the center. And I think that both the values of embodied solidarity and authentic leadership and authentic allyship are such that really places people and their own values at the center, especially people of color, especially people who have been historically marginalized and oppressed. Decenter practice promotes giving space. It gives away power. I often find that's one of my many observations in the spaces where often, even when we are sort of acting with the values of social justice, we're still are drawing power to ourselves, drawing power to my voice, my wisdom, how smart I am. And really, when you are decentered, again, you are giving voice and placing people of color at the center of that process. And when you do that, I think that really leads into strategic coalitions. And building coalitions, it's about sharing, identifying shared interests, taking the time through listening, through conversation to have what those shared interests are. And I think that leads into starting to tell a new story, that it's different than our default stories that are designed to divide and exploit us. I like to sort of end with a brief quote from an article that we'll link in the resources by Jamie Grant. And they say that allyship is often performative, loud and shiny, and shows how smart we are talking about racism or oppression. Solidarity work is often quieter, deeper, and behind the scenes. Thank you.
Thank you, Armando. Thanks for the reminding us about decentering and putting people of color at the center in our work, our allyship. Okay, Pat, what would you like to add to this rich discussion we're having this afternoon?
Well, it appears that Armando and I talked about what stories I was going to tell, but I have to share this one. For me, what does real action look like? It's when a person can realize what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in a quote, that justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inseparable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. True, authentic allyship gets that. An authentic ally has made the choice to live their life in a certain way, always maintaining anti-racist values and behaviors, especially when the situation calls for an anti-racist response. But Armando, it may not always be quiet. Here's the next story I want to share with you. This is called Walk in Authority, in Solidarity. A colleague and myself were doing trainings in Baltimore. It was a three all-day training. We are in our suits, got our pumps on, right? We're coming, three sisters in pumps all day. That's key to the story. So we go to the Inner Harbor, have lunch, debrief our day. We start going across the street to get a taxi to go to our hotel. And it's one of those, you know how it is in Baltimore by the Inner Harbor. There's this 5-star hotel, right? And all the cabs are lined up on the side. So we know the rules. We go right to the front taxi. Well, also on his way out of this 5-star hotel is this tall white man who looks like he might be affluent. He's got his garment bag over his shoulder and his briefcase in his hand. Well, we arrive to the taxi cab first. And so we tell the driver where we're going and we go to get in the passenger side. Well, he steps in front of the back door and we like, well, you know what? He says, no, I'm going to take this gentleman. So he beckons to him to come. And so, okay, so, we're from Milwaukee. We had a couple of things to say about that. And we said it loudly. And the gentleman gets to the cab and he looks at us and he says, what's the problem here? We look at him and said, he won't let us ride. He said, he won't. With his garment bag over his shoulder and his briefcase in his hand, he lifts his foot up and kicks that door shut and looks at the guy and said, if they can't ride, I'm not riding. Then we looked at each other. He said, let's go to the next cab and see what we get. So we together, we walk in solidarity to the next. This is a true story. Walk in solidarity to the next cab. While this guy sees, what's going on. He comes on around and he looks at the guy. He said, are we gonna have a problem? And the guy says, no, what the guy did was wrong and he should have took you all. And he opens the door for us. We said, thank you. And the guy said, ladies, you have a good evening. We said, you have safe travels. We get it in the taxi cab. Now here's the part that I think is important to understand about solidarity. When we get in the cab, the cabbie tells us, that guy is going to lose all kind of ways today. We said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, the rule is if you're in the front and you don't take that right, you got to drive all the way around and get in the back of the line. He said, he's going to be another hour and a half before he gets another ride. We're like, wow. And he said, it might not have been racist, but he might have thought that guy was on his way to the airport. He said, yeah, he would have been my ride. And I thought about it, how all four of us was a victim of this systemic kind of racist bias thought this guy had. So me and Glenda, we're talking, he gets us to our hotel and we said, we want to bless you. How much does it cost to go to the airport? He tells us and we tip him that cost. And he says, wow, thank you, ladies. He said, well, when are you going home? We told him when we go home. He said, how about I pick you guys up and take you to the airport? I said, good. And please tell that guy, we got you 3 times. That's solidarity. That is solidarity. When you see wrong and you live a life where you understand that what affects one impacts us all, you take a stand, regardless. I don't know if the guy missed his his plane, but for him, making sure that right was done at that time was important. So here is, I think, the takeaway. When an ally realizes injustice anywhere includes them, they become invested in anti-racist behavior. We walk together. If you are in solidarity, you just keep pressing on. When you get weary, don't stop. Understand we're further along than we were when we first started this movement. There is a popular quote crafted by a group of Aboriginal rights activists from Queensland, Australia in the 1970s. It is often attributed to Lilla Watson, a member of that particular group. She says this: if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let us work together.
I like to pause there because these stories and these thoughts that you're sharing are so powerful. I want to give them a moment or two to sink in. So now it's time to say thank you to each of you for sharing yourselves and your insights. And turning to you, our viewers, we welcome you to be reflective on what you've heard from our panelists on authentic allyship. We challenge you to hold up a mirror to yourself and ask, what does authentic allyship look like in my life? So there are a number of resources in the toolkit associated with this training video that may be of help to you as you begin on this journey, this never-ending journey, as we've heard today. The Guide to Allyship is one, and it offers 7 points on what it means to be an ally. I'd like to share the first 3 with you. Number 1, take on the struggle as your own. 2, transfer the benefits of your privilege to those who lack it. And 3, amplify voices of the oppressed before your own. We thank you for being part of this discussion with us today.